Consequences for us are going to be very severe in any case. When this is over, and it will end, it's not going to go on forever. The Russians will dictate the terms that are ultimately accepted for the termination of this war. They will terminate it on their grounds. I have no doubt about that. Between now and then, you're going to see more than Hungary and Slovakia break from the pack. I think you're going to see others break from the pack. This recent election in Moldova, that looks like that was a rigged outcome to keep them inside the European Union and within the NATO fold. Romania has been through this already. But the populations in those areas, they don't support any of this stuff. All of the globalist elites are betting that their populations will sit there and take it and do nothing. Now, it doesn't look like that's going to be the case in France or in Great Britain. But at the moment, I think the elites are still betting on it. And they're assuming that they can order their forces into the streets to suppress people. Now, in Great Britain, the police have been remarkably successful at suppressing and punishing the British people in favor of people inside their country who are not British. But having said all of that, I don't think that that's going to last over the long term. They're doomed. This whole globalist class is doomed. They have no staying power. They will not last much longer. And if we can hold our fire long enough, I think is the Russian view, then they'll be gone and we can bring an end to this. But it's getting tougher. And I really do think there is enormous pressure on President Putin, in this supposedly authoritarian state where the people have no say. The Russian people have a hell of a lot of influence over what their government does, and they want blood. They want an end to this, and they want these people that are against them to be crushed. I don't blame them. I understand that completely. But it hasn't happened yet. But I think they're getting closer and closer to this tragic solution.
Well, and if they needed help getting into the more of the tragic, we seem to be helping them with our own policies here, because Secretary of State Rubio addressed the United Nations Security Council a few days back and said that, by the way, if Meritz had just said that we're not at war, but we're no longer at peace, Rubio says we're not at war, but the war can't be won by anybody on the ground.
But the one that's proved to be an extraordinarily challenge has been the war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. The president has worked on it tirelessly, has invested a tremendous amount of his own time, energy, and the highest levels of our government. We have had meetings in Turkey, meetings in Saudi Arabia, meetings in Alaska, countless phone calls, doing everything possible to bring this conflict to a resolution and to an end. A war that cannot end militarily. It will end at a negotiating table. That's where this war will end. But the longer it lasts, the more people will die, the more will be destroyed. Some of the numbers we are seeing in the loss of life among military personnel, for example, on the Russian Federation side, are staggering. Staggering. In 1 month alone, more loss of life than in the entirety of the U.S. engagement in Afghanistan or Iraq. This war has to end, and we have done everything we possibly can and will continue to do everything we possibly can to bring it to an end. Very generous offers have been made. For example, a ceasefire at the current lines of contact.
Let's start with that last one right there. What about this generous offer that Trump has made to Putin to allow him to have an unconditional ceasefire at the line of contact?
Well, we've never had the truth in the West about the actual losses on the ground in that country. We know that the losses on the Ukrainian side, 1.7 to 1.8 million. The losses imputed to the Russians are fanciful nonsense. If those losses were that high, we would be in a very different position. The fact is that those losses haven't been that high. And that's one of the reasons the Russians have been so comfortable exercising restraint, because they ultimately have wanted to avoid a conflict with us and NATO at large. Unfortunately, and I say this because I mean it, the Russians have taken a lot of the statements that we've made, and they're looking at them very seriously. We're seeing a broader mobilization in Russia of people between the ages of 18 and 25, men. We're seeing this force continue to grow. The training is rigorous. The discipline is very effective. The leadership now, I would say, is superb, because all the leaders who were really bad news have been largely removed. The Russians are preparing for war with us. We are not prepared for war with them. Those are the facts. The Europeans least of all. And remember that you've had Donald Trump, contrary to what Secretary Rubio says, who's turned around and said, look, we'll sell you whatever you want. And this is yours to fight. We're effectively going to sit this out. So here's Rubio making threatening statements, or at least implying threats, when the president of the United States has said, no, we're not going to engage in this. We're not going to jump in with both feet. We'll give you weapons. Well, the problem is most of the weapons, and you know this from having, you just discussed very recently the inventories of missiles. A lot of those will never show up in time to make any difference, assuming they ever show up at all. The issue at the moment, as I understand it, is do we launch Tomahawk missiles against the Russians deep inside Russia? Well, I don't think that's ever going to happen, because however misguided and misinformed Donald Trump may be, I think he understands that if a Tomahawk missile lands in the outskirts of Moscow or Ryazan or Kazan or any of these places, he's going to be at war with Russia. And that war could rapidly escalate to the nuclear level. And once you hit the nuclear level, you have almost no control. We know that from experience in multiple war games, and everyone loses. So I think Donald Trump probably understands that. Maybe he doesn't understand the impact of his words or the words of someone like Rubio or Hegseth. We need to go back and look at that very carefully. Ambassador Freeman will tell you this from his own experience. Words are meaningful when they come out of the mouth of the president, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of War. They're taken very seriously. So you better be very careful what the hell you're saying. And right now, I don't think anybody is.
Yeah, and I want to reinforce that point, because we happen to have that soundbite set up here. When you're talking about even those key areas here, when you also have the hand-selected specific person to run the issue with the Ukraine side from the president of the United States, his personal envoy, saying this.
Are you saying, though, that it is the president's position that Ukraine can conduct long-range strikes into Russia, that has been authorized by the president?
I think reading what he has said and reading what Vice President Vance has said, as well as Secretary Rubio, the answer is yes. Use the ability to hit deep. There are no such things as sanctuaries. That's one of the reasons I believe that this last week, and it has been confirmed, that President Zelensky asked President Trump to get Tomahawk missiles, which give you a depth.
Are we giving him the Tomahawks?
Well, that decision has not been made, but he's asked. I know that President Zelensky did, in fact, ask for them. That's going to be up to the president to do it.
So what do you make of the fact that he's saying that out loud? Oh, yes. Well, I know that Zelensky asked for it and they're considering it. They haven't approved it yet, but he is talking about it out loud, but did say, yes, they can fire deeper into Russia with our capabilities. What do you make of those two things?
I think there's a lack of understanding of just how robust and capable the Russian military establishment is. I think there is an underestimation of the seriousness with which these statements are taken in Moscow. And I think there is a lot of self-delusion, especially with Kellogg. Kellogg runs around and tries to tell everybody the Russians are losing. Well, that's news to them. And everybody else who's looking at the battlefield objectively doesn't see any evidence for that. They see essentially a war of annihilation being waged against the Ukrainian forces. He's operating in a universe where the rest of us aren't present. I hope that's not the case with President Trump, but he seems to be terribly influenced far too often by the last person that spoke with him. And the last people that have been talking to him have been feeding him these erroneous statements and utterly false data to try and persuade him to take a position that I think otherwise he would not take. I don't know what else to say. I mean, that's where we are, I think.
Well, and in fact, that you mentioned that Kellogg has said Russia is losing. He actually said that 2 weeks ago on Saturday. You've had former Secretary of State Pompeo go on Fox News a few days back and reinforce that same thing, that we can be a lot more aggressive because Russia's losing anyway. And I suspect that that's what undergirded Trump when he made that Truth Social about a week or so ago, when he said that I now understand the situation on the ground a lot better. And it turns out that Ukraine is in a position to fight and win, we call caps, all of Ukraine back to its original form with time, patience, and financial support. Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where this war started, is very much an option. Now, I'm going to get to what Sergei Lavrov just earlier today actually had to say about that. But what does this deepen your concern that people are telling Trump that and he may actually believe it?
Well, it does disturb me that he might believe it. Now, there's another theory advanced by Alistair Crook that suggests Trump doesn't believe it, but Trump wants to keep the war going as a means of, quote unquote, tying down Russia tying down its resources, its manpower, so that it is in no position to help or assist Iran, which now looms on the horizon as a new target array for the U.S. and Israeli armed forces. That may be true. I find that extremely dangerous and very, very difficult to accept, but it's not impossible. Let's keep the Russians tied down. The problem is that while the Russians have a lot of ground forces involved in this, when you look at the technologies that are required to assist somebody like Iran, they don't extend to ground troops.
Yeah.
And the technologies, the weapon systems, the advice, the assistance, that's entirely divorced from what's happening in Ukraine or Eastern Europe. So I have trouble accepting that. It's not impossible. I just think that unfortunately we're dealing with the impulsive nature of the president. He's very impulsive. He's supposedly announced that we're going to invade Venezuela on the ground. I haven't seen his statement per se, but I've seen these things on X telling us that he's now made this commitment. That could turn into the largest Latin American crusade against the Yankee North that we have ever witnessed. So I hope that's not true. But I don't see any sense of economy. Now, when I say that, usually when you go into any conflict, you want to isolate your opponent and you want to minimize the assistance and support your opponent may get. That's called practicing economy of enemies. We, on the other hand, seem to be determined to make as many enemies as we possibly can. Perhaps this goes back to the delusional statement that we're the greatest, we're the most powerful, and no one can stand against us, which, as you know, does appeal to large numbers of Americans. Needless to say, we said that during the Vietnam War. That didn't turn out to be accurate. We've said it on numerous occasions in numerous places. It wasn't accurate. Before we landed in Normandy, the intelligence assessment said the German military was finished. They were demoralized, couldn't fight, and the landing should go very, very well without much difficulty. Well, we landed on the 6th of June. We never broke out until almost mid-July. So much for the weakened and incapable German force. I think that a lot of this goes on in Washington. It's dangerous. We need more sober-minded people. And all of this occurs against the backdrop of some ugly realities, that the dollar is really not the reserve currency anymore. Gold is becoming the reserve currency. And our bond market is very fragile. And when that finally collapses, and I think that's coming, we're going to have a tough time holding our own financial system and economy together. And the disease that we have with debt and debt finance consumption and overspending and so forth extends to our allies in Europe as well. So it doesn't make any sense. No sane person looking at the world, looking at our conditions here at home, would embark on 3 separate wars at once.
Yeah, well, no sane person should choose to embark on any war. And by the way, I won't play that soundbite here, but that's one of the other things that Hegseth said this morning that really got my alarm bells going, because he said, we want to have this greatest force so that we can win any war we choose or that we're forced into. He actually caught himself, so I'm a little Freudian slip there, but that seems to be the mentality, which hopefully doesn't apply that way. Now, I mentioned Trump talking about the original borders, whether he was talking about 1991 or 2022. That, again, to your point, that when the words are spoken by senior American officials, especially the president, they are heard in Moscow. And Sergei Lavrov, in a video that was released this morning, addressed exactly that point.
All these talks about returning to the borders of some years, this must be forgotten. You know what I want to tell you? All these talks about returning to the borders of some years have been going on for a long time. They are all connected with the fact that the Ukrainian leaders, who came to power after February 2014 by illegal means, constantly lied and disrupted all the agreements that were reached over these years. If in February 2014, the signed agreement between the then president and the opposition, guaranteed by Germany, France, and Poland, if it had been implemented, then Ukraine would now be within the 1991 borders.
That is a strong statement that actually Putin has made a number of times. And I think when you look back at the historical records, I think they're right. If we in the West wanted Ukraine, Kiev to have control over its 1991 borders, it was in our power to do so. But we took the opportunity to take it out by trying to demand even more. Is he just exaggerating there, making Russia sound good, or does he have a point?
No, I think he's telling you the truth. And after all, if you look at the Russian military establishment in 2014 and then even look at it again in 2022, this was not a large military establishment designed to project Russian power hundreds or thousands of miles from Russia. It was largely focused on territorial defense. And at the time, I know that President Putin made it very clear we have no interest in going to war at all. We don't want to do this. He had just been through the intervention with the Georgians, as you'll recollect, in
2008.
Yeah, 2008. The Russian military did not perform very well. There were a lot of problems with it. He had to sort of start over with his reforms and reorganization plans. So he wasn't interested in any sort of conflict at all. Even in 2022, I would argue he wasn't interested in the conflict. But I think that's also in part because he was always representing the Western wing of Russian political thought. He was someone that saw Russia as being part of the broader European civilization. He's now lost a lot of credibility as a result of that. Large numbers of Russians reject that out of hand now. They see no hope for any inclusion of Russia into anything, largely because of us and what we've demanded. There's I don't usually go to Hollywood films, but there's a film called Nicholas and Alexandra. And it's a tragic film. It's based on a book by Massey. But what's important in the film is the moment when the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, decides to go to war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. And there's this fictional figure because the person that he's playing at that point in time, Stolypin, I think it is, was dead. And Sir Laurence Olivier plays that role. And he's there talking into one ear of the Tsar while the Tsar is listening to all of his generals and political favorites and courtiers and so forth. And we have a lot of that in Washington now. We have large numbers of what used to be called court generals, people that curried favor with the king or the emperor, became a favorite and were then promoted as a result. Russia had a big problem with that in 1914. But he kept saying, if you do this, everything could be lost. In most cases, these large-scale wars, whatever reason there was that started them, no one remembers at the end because the end is destruction. And he makes a very good case, and I think that's what President Trump needs to listen to. He's not listening to the potential disasters that could ensue as a result of the decisions he's making. And again, I go back to Venezuela as the most recent example of stupidity, because I don't think he really understands, or anybody in Washington can appreciate, the level of anger and hostility this will precipitate in Latin America. We have a long history of being viewed as responsible for all the problems they've got. Well, that's wrong. Most of theirs, like most of ours, frankly, are self-generated. Yeah. We make our own problems. But the anti-Yankee feeling, the anti-American feeling is very strong, and it'll become a spreading disease like the plague. And you'll have paramilitaries from all over that continent pouring into Venezuela. This will become the cause of the 21st century. Drive the evil Yankees out once and for all. And we lose sight of things. Look at Ukraine. Look at the size of the place. How many Iraqs can you fit into Ukraine? Nobody ever brings that up. But if you look at the map, you have 3 or 4 Iraqs make Ukraine. Does size count? Yeah, it counts. Venezuela has a coastline 1,700 miles long. Mm. The place has a 1,380 or 79 mile border with Colombia and the same distance border with Brazil. It's the size of Germany and France together. I mean, size matters. It's huge. And what do you want to do? What's your purpose? Is your goal to forcibly extract oil and natural gas? Have we learned nothing from our experience in the Middle East? You don't have to park a tank on top of the oil well to get the oil out. Everybody will sell it to you. But if they're not going to sell it to you, you got to ask why. Is that because of your sanctions? Is it because of your behavior towards them? None of that is under discussion. We're now turning to the brute force sort of option, and we're congratulating ourselves on it and telling us we're the best, we're the biggest. And I guess we can infer that the message to all the flags is get on board, get on the train with the rest of us. We're going to conquer the world. I mean, I don't really know what they wanted to do other than lead a pep rally, but it sounded to me a lot like, well, the pep rally is get on board with us. We're going to war. Yay!